For today's video, we'll probably have to make a few videos, and there's not going to be a lot of images. It will mostly be just me talking. There's a lot of history that I'd like to make sure that we cover, so we're going to try and do that very quickly here. It starts out with the death of Hezekiah, and as you see in the reading in 2 Kings 21, when Hezekiah dies, Manasseh becomes king. Now, when Manasseh becomes king, Assyria has not yet taken over Egypt. So Egypt is being ruled by a group of Cushites. They're from Nubia, way down south. They've taken over it, and they're very, very anti-Assyrian. They're a powerful group. They're the ones that have come to help Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah. They've been fairly powerful, but they're not as powerful as Assyria. So eventually, the Assyrians will, through both political and a little bit of military pressure, oust the Cushites. They'll kick them out, and they help some Libyan groups that are living here in the Delta take over Egypt. They put them in control, and they start to rule all of Egypt, not just Egypt proper. South of Egypt proper, the Cushites still rule a very Egyptian-like kingdom in their homeland, but this area is going to now be very pro-Assyrian, and they're going to start to control the Syria-Canaan area in behalf of Egypt or Assyria. When Assyria is dealing with all sorts of stuff elsewhere in their empire, they leave this area largely to the Egyptians to control on their behalf. That's what's happening for the most part when Manasseh is king. So, Manasseh is ruling. He's completely dominated by Assyria, and for much of this it's the Egyptian control of Assyria. He's portrayed as the worst of rulers, amazingly wicked, builds up idolatry in every way possible. He's attributed with the murder of Isaiah. Tradition has it that Isaiah knew he wanted to kill him, and so he fled and was being pursued, and by this time he's old, and he hides in a hollow tree, and they figure out he's in there and saw the tree in half, in effect cutting him in half. Not a very nice way for Isaiah to die. Don't know if it's true or not. It's tradition. As I said, he's very dominated by Assyria, and as a result, he drinks in Assyrian culture, and so there's a huge buildup of Assyrian gods. Ashur, Ishtar, Queen of Heaven, and other astral deities are worshipped. Now, we do learn one other thing from the Chronicles account. In the Chronicles account, when Manasseh does start to rebel just a little bit, the Assyrians come and bring him to Babylon. You see, Babylon is part of the Assyrian Empire at this time, and he is put in fetters there, and when he's in affliction, he besought the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. And he prayed unto him, entreated him, and his prayer was heard. He's brought back to Jerusalem, and he starts to rebuild the city and the temple and all sorts of things, and he takes away the strange gods and the idol out of the house of the Lord. So, according to the Chronicles account, at least by the end of Manasseh's life, he's starting to repent, but it's the very end, and not much happens. I mean, he's repairing the altar of the Lord and all sorts of things, but really, it's too late, too little too late. The people are still following in his wickedness. When Manasseh dies, his son Amon is put on the throne, but he only reigns for 2 years. You're now starting to see things that are more like the northern kingdom because of this idolatry and wickedness. He does that which is evil in the sight of the Lord. He does all of the wrong things, and he is killed when he has been reigning just for 2 years. His own servants conspire against him and kill him, and then his son is made king, the people of the land, and that's a group we don't know about, but we'll try and learn more about them in class. But the people of the land slay the servants and make Josiah king in his stead in consultation with the high priest. Alright, so we resume our reading, or our videos, with Josiah, who is a very, very important king, one of the most important kings in the history of Israel, and I think that it's quite likely that the book of Kings is finished during Josiah's reign, or I mean, most of it is finished during his reign. Some of it is obviously just thereafter, but some of the writing happens during Josiah's reign, I think, and shortly thereafter. He's so important, we'll spend time talking about him in class, or for the independent study course, you'll read more about him. in the reading assignments. But there are a few things that are worth pointing out. It is during his reign that religious reforms happen again. He's very much like Hezekiah and tries to bring about as many religious reforms as possible. He centralizes worship in Jerusalem again, regulates the priests, and does as much as he can to try and bring about righteousness and get the people of Judah to worship God and only God, or Jehovah and only Jehovah again. This book is found during his reign. We'll talk more about that in the class or the lessons. It's very important. And then he probably rebels against Assyria. It's not completely clear, but probably, because he dies up at Megiddo. And I'll show you a picture of that. Alright, I only got pictures of Tel Megiddo, this hill here, on a hazy day, but you can get a little feel for it. There's another picture from the other side, and you can see these chunks are where they've done archaeology and taken it out. But a big hill there. And here's a reconstruction of what it would have looked like with the walls around it and the gate and so on. So this is what it would have looked like during the time when Josiah is having some kind of a battle with Necho, king of Egypt, and is killed there. I have a friend who argues that he's executed, but the Bible tells us he's killed in battle. One way or the other, he has some problem with the Assyrians and dies there. Now, something that's worth thinking about as we go through all of this is that these events that we're reading about here in the 2nd Chronicles account and in the 2nd Kings account really happened during Lehi's day. Lehi is probably a youth when this book is found and the covenant is made, and he seems to be influenced by that. He's going to be familiar with Josiah and so on, and all the rest of what we're reading about are some things that happen in the time of Lehi's day, and we'll eventually, by the end of these videos, get to when Lehi and his family leave Jerusalem and go even past that. So this is also the history that Lehi is familiar with. When Josiah dies, his son Jehoahaz, whom we call Jehoahaz II, is put on the throne. This people of the land bypass his older brother and put him in control, and he voluntarily submits to Egypt, and again Egypt is acting on behalf of Assyria. But there start to be some problems with Babylon, and Egypt is having to deal with this. And then eventually what happens is Pharaoh comes in, Necho again, and he comes in and says, hey, you guys can't choose who is going to be king. This is really a whole power struggle we see going on. You can't choose who's going to be king. I get to choose who's going to be king. And so he will change who is the king. He takes this older brother, Eliakim, changes his name to Jehoiakim, and he's going to use, we're going to have rulers with similar names after this just to confuse us. But he changes it to Jehoiakim and makes him king. And Jehoiakim supports Egypt even when it's clear that Egypt is not going to do really well, and there are problems with this. Jehoiakim has a lot of encounters with Jeremiah, so when we get into the book of Jeremiah, look for Jehoiakim. They encounter each other quite a bit. Jeremiah also knew Josiah and mourned his passing, I'm sure, and so on, but we'll read a lot about Jehoiakim. Now, eventually, when Babylon starts to become really powerful, we're going to have Jehoiakim transferring his allegiance from Necho II to Nebuchadnezzar. This is around 604 or 603 BC. And he'll be loyal to Babylon for a short while, but in 600 BC he withholds tribute, and that will bring about some interesting things. Now, to understand all of this, we need to know what happened to the Assyrian Empire and why do we have a Babylonian Empire now. So we're going to do the next video. We'll start out with that. Alright, so we need to understand what's happening historically to understand what's happening with Jerusalem and Judah. The Assyrian Empire, which at this point is now controlling all of this vast territory, controls and fully dominates its southern neighbor Babylon. Now, Babylon has been an empire in and of itself before. They're a culturally prestigious group, and they really don't like being ruled by the Assyrians who are coming here out of Ashur. That's where Assyria gets its name from, and Nineveh is the capital at this point. And so they have been continually trying to find a way to rebel. What they eventually do is they get the Medes and the Persians, which are over here on the other side of the mountains, They're over here in modern-day Iran. Susa is where the Persians are, and so on. So what's happening over here on the other side of the Ural Mountains is that there are two groups of tribes, the Medes and the Persians. Very tribal society out here in the steppe land, where horses graze and this kind of a thing. And the Medes have congealed more than the Persians and have kind of gotten the upper hand. They're the powerful group in the area, and they dominate the Persians somewhat. The Babylonians convince the Medes to work with them, and the Medes get the Persians to work with them, and between the three of them they will overthrow Assyria, and Babylon will take over the Assyrian Empire, kind of controlling this area and kind of working with the Medes and Persians. Now we'll come back to this alliance with the Medes and Persians later because it proves to be very important. But as a result, Babylon the Assyrian Empire falls almost overnight, and Babylon just steps in and takes over this area. They're not able to take over Egypt right away because Egypt was mostly controlling this area. They do have to fight Egypt to get control of the Syria Canaanite area, or Israel and Judah, these areas around there. But they do end up taking control of it pretty quickly, so that they control pretty much this same area. Thus, you end up with the Babylonian Empire right here, not quite down to Egypt, as I said, but controlling all of this area. That's pretty much what the Persian Empire was. And so suddenly, the Israelites find themselves, or the Judahites, Yehudit, or Jews, find themselves needing to give their allegiance to Babylon. That's why Jehoiakim is waffling back and forth. Should he support Egypt? They're the ones who put him on the throne, and they seem to be controlling this area. And even when it looks like they're going to fall, for the most part, he is supporting Egypt until it's clear there's no way they're going to withstand Babylon. And then he switches his allegiance to Babylon. But eventually, about 600 BC, he withholds tribute from them. It seems to be hoping that Egypt will come and help him once again. And he seems to be trusting in that because Babylon has tried to invade Egypt and has not been able to. As a result of this withhold of tribute, which is seen as rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar sends Chaldeans, Syrians, Moabites, Ammonites, and a whole bunch of other people, a combined army against Judah. And this is not going to go well for them. In the midst of all this, Jehoiakim dies, and his son Jehoiakim succeeds him. He's only 18 years old. He reigns for 3 months, and by then Nebuchadnezzar comes with the main army and subdues all of them. He's going to carry Jehoiakim off into Babylon and a lot of other important Jews. He starts this deportation practice that the Assyrians have practiced in the past, so that he will carry away a lot of the elite and various groups of Babylon. He's going to take a couple of groups. One group, a large group of Babylonians, or of Jews, are going to end up in Babylon and build a little colony there. And Ezekiel is part of that group. So while Jeremiah is back here in Jerusalem prophesying to the Jews there, Ezekiel is going to be prophesying to the Jews here in Babylon. Daniel is taken as just a youth and ends up in the capital of Babylon, and later we'll get to his story as he becomes kind of a nobleman and a counselor there in Babylon. But all of that happens at this time when Babylon carries away its first group of captives, starting what we call the diaspora, or the scattering of the Jews, or the Babylonian captivity. It's in stages, and it begins at this point, though it will happen much more extensively later. So we just finished with a bunch of Jews being carried into Babylon. Jehoiakim is taken captive there, will spend the rest of his life there in captivity, and his uncle, a fellow named Zedekiah, is put on the throne. Now, again, we get back to Book of Mormon times, because Lehi leaves during the first year of Zedekiah's reign. Jeremiah has been put in prison one of several times. He will be put in prison, and we'll deal with that when we get to Jeremiah. Lots of interesting stuff. Fascinating book. But he's in prison, Lehi is leaving, and Zedekiah is basically a puppet king on the throne. Now, he and Jehoiakim have to deal with a lot of very difficult factions. The issue is that Babylon is very, very powerful, and there are a number of people who say they should just submit to Babylon, send in their tribute, send in their taxes and their men, and get along. At the same time, there are a whole bunch of people who say, hey, we're the promised people and the promised land, the covenant people, chosen people. God will protect us. We should rebel against Babylon, and he will protect us just like he did in the days of Hezekiah. Laman and Lemuel, for instance, the Book of Mormon, Laman and Lemuel fall into that category, and that they seem to agree with a whole lot of people in Jerusalem in that there's no way Jerusalem can fall, and they believe this because it was recently, a few generations back, miraculously rescued by God. What they're missing is that happened because they had a righteous king who was getting rid of idolatry, and they were following that righteous king. And without that, they're not going to have the promises. But this is what the different kings are having to deal with. These two competing factions that are very, very strong. They're getting more pressure than a president with both Democrats and Republicans to have to deal with. Tremendous amount of pressure. Jeremiah is encouraging them to just submit to Babylon, but there are a lot of false prophets, as we'll encounter when we get to the book of Jeremiah. Many false prophets who are just saying, no, get rid of this yoke. God will help us. We're his covenant people. He will help us get rid of them. That's the problem that they're having, and that's why we'll often see them waffling back and forth and supporting Babylon and then not supporting Babylon and so on. Zedekiah will fall into that trap where he's a loyal puppet to the Babylonians, and then when the Babylonians are gone for a while, he starts to think maybe they can get away with this. And an Egyptian pharaoh comes up and visits him and tells him about all his wonderful victories and how powerful he's been. So I'm sorry, you'll have to forgive me. There we go. The computer was trying to go to sleep. He starts to think that, maybe we can rebel against Babylon, and Egypt will help us, and we'll be all right. So he does rebel against Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar comes up out of Babylon, marches over with a big army, and destroys all sorts of things. There's a siege and so on. Now, he does pretty much the same thing that the Assyrians did, where he marches through the countryside, destroying town after town, city after city, in pretty much the same order, so that by the end we end up with the same couple of cities left. The last three fortified cities to remain are Azekah, Lachish, and Jerusalem. Okay, here's a picture of Azekah, and yes, it's got this big sign in the middle, but just so you get an idea of how far we are. Beit Shemesh, 11 kilometers away, Jerusalem 38 kilometers away, not too far away. Here are some of my Jerusalem Center students. We're standing in the Valley of Elah where David killed Goliath and looking at Azekah. It was up here on this hill. There were big walls around it. Pretty tough city to get because it's such a steep hill with big walls and so on. Not much is left of those walls now, but you can see a little bit of the remains of the walls right there. After Azekah falls, the last city left before Jerusalem is Lachish, the same Lachish that was the last city left before Jerusalem when Sennacherib the Assyrian attacked them. And the interesting thing is, you can see here this picture and the towers from the gate that had been built. So there's a new gate built since Sennacherib's day or Hezekiah's day because so much had been destroyed. And they found in one of these towers some letters that had been written. One of these letters says, "We've seen the watchfires of Azekah go out." It's a warning to Jerusalem. They know that they're next. They're about to be attacked next. They write this letter to let them know, but the letter never makes it out before the Babylonians make it to them. They know they're next when the fires go out. Imagine that feeling. They don't even have time to get warning out before the Babylonians come. So we pick up with our siege of the city of Jerusalem. Eventually the Babylonians march up to Jerusalem. Let me get you a map. Alright, so you can see that the Assyrians have come in and they've gone through all this area, Beit Shemesh and so on. Now, Marishah is a fortified city at this time, and it would make more sense to me if they'd come down along this way, Beit Shemesh, Azekah, then Marishah, then Lachish. But the Bible's pretty specific that the last three cities are Azekah, then Lachish, then Jerusalem. So I don't know if they conquered Marishah ahead of time or if the folks in Marishah had divided themselves up, some gone to Azekah and some Lachish or something. I don't know why. It's not part of this. But in any case, after Azekah falls, they go through the Guvrin Valley and down into the Lachish Valley, and they conquer Lachish. And then they can come up through this low hill country and get into the high hills where they will come up to Jerusalem. Maybe they go all the way back and come up through the Beit Shemesh Valley up to Jerusalem. One or the other. But they eventually end up coming here to Jerusalem. And when they end up in Jerusalem, This is looking down from basically where the administrative centers would have been, what was the old city or palace of David, next to the palace of the kings, and then the temple, but this is where the administrative building would have been. Looking down into the Kidron Valley where the army would have lined up as it's surrounding and laying siege to Jerusalem. So we're looking down at the Babylonian army if we are Jews in Jeremiah's day. This is just to give you an idea of that city. So here's the temple, here's the palace that the kings are living in. This was David's palace. It becomes the administrative building. It's from there we were looking down, and the walls were all around here. And it's here in the Kidron Valley and going around into the other valleys that the army is laying siege. Now, just outside of that administrative building, there are a whole bunch of walls built right up, or homes built right up next to the walls. This is kind of a weird. It doesn't curve like that. It's because they did a panorama. Oh, that's me there teaching. But I'll show you another picture, but I just want you to get an idea that there's a house here. It's a two-story house with a little walkway, and another house here with a walkway. They're all two-story houses. I'll show you another picture. All right, this is again looking down at that Kidron Valley, that view we had before, but here you can see where those houses are that we're talking about. And if you remember in that kind of curved panorama view that they'd built this up to keep the two-story house, one of the two-story houses, from collapsing in, so you can see the picture there or here. All right, so this is one house, here's another house. The reason I'm showing you this is because these houses are right against the wall. We have found lots of arrowheads in these walls and in these houses. This house right here is known as a burnt house because the layer of ash in there was huge. The evidence everywhere in these buildings is from the Babylonian destruction. Clearly, the Babylonians were successful in their siege. It was a long siege, but then they burned the entire place down, and you've read that account where they burned it and carried everyone away captive, and everyone goes into Babylon. Now Zedekiah tries to flee. So he's going to go from Jerusalem, he's going to try and flee. They don't have it on here, but Jericho is right down, right about here. He's going to try and flee. He gets caught at Jericho. And according to the biblical account, they get him and all of his sons, they take him captive to Babylon. And the gruesome story is they want him to know the last thing he sees is that there will be no line coming from him. So they kill all his sons and then take hot iron and poke his eyes out so that the last thing he sees is the end of his line. We know from the Book of Mormon that one of his sons snuck away so stealthily that even the biblical writers didn't know about it. Mulek snuck away and successfully escaped and ended up in the Americas. But this is the end of the kingdom of Judah. All of the Jews are taken captive into Babylon, and the story will take up from there. But it's a huge, huge event. We can't overemphasize this event. Now there is a group of Jews, and Jeremiah is one of these, who against his will is taken down into Egypt. A huge group of Jews move down into Egypt with the permission of the Babylonians. Jeremiah goes with them. He and a number of Jews will die in Egypt, and they set up their own colony there and build their own temples in Egypt as well. But most of the story will stay with the group that goes to Babylon. That's it.